Welcome to the InfoMullet YouTube channel. If you enjoy this content, please like or share. And if you'd like to support the InfoMullet by becoming a mulleteer, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate your support. Welcome. This is the InfoMullet Coronavirus Live Ask Me Anything. It is Wednesday, I guess the 8th. It feels like a year has passed since I started doing these about 3 weeks ago. I'm Timothy Clancy, your chief mulleteer. This is Bonky, the emotional support donkey, who provides emotional support and very limited commentary. Going to be a pack today, so some housekeeping items. If you want folks who might benefit from seeing this, feel free to share the video. If you like what we do and the information we provide, consider becoming a mulleteer subscriber. The link is in the discussion, has all the links of the articles I'll be talking about today, and there's a link to Patreon. It's www.patreon.com/infomullet. It's $5 a month for a mulleteer. We appreciate all the support we can get. And what we're going to go ahead and get started with today is something I've been wanting to do for a couple weeks now, but I've just been catching up with the day in and day out forecasts of what's happening with the virus, what's happening with the economics, what's happening with the violence, and or the concerns about violence, not that there's violence, but the concerns about it. And what it really has to do with is media literacy. How do we evaluate the information we're getting when there's just this crush of information? And some of it has valid disagreements on the science, and some of it is wrong. Some of it is, information disinformation. We have various state actors putting out information. We have people with political agendas on both the red and the blue side. How do we evaluate all this information? And so I wanted to do a brief, quick divergence into what I call sort of crisis epistemology and give us some tools for how we can evaluate information. So obviously epistemology and philosophy is a huge topic of how do we know that what we know is true, but we're living in a global pandemic and don't have time to go to a big university seminar. So I'm going to do this very, very briefly. When we think about truth, there's really three kinds of truth we can talk about that are relevant to things like coronavirus, right? The simplest truth are what we would call essential truths. These are truths that are true because we have defined them to be true. What I mean by that is when we say a triangle has three sides, that becomes an essential truth because by definition, any triangle will have three sides. You cannot get away. It's a defined truth. It's most useful in things like math and pure logic. You can go back to Euclid's geometry, and all the forms that he builds on are built upon these essential truths. And math and abstract consists of essential truths, but essential truths not really helpful right now because nothing is that abstract and ideal. Essential truths only exist in how we define them. So the second kind of truth that people often, I think, latch onto is what we might call objective truth or empirical truth. And this is a truth that has been tested through hypothesis, has been proven through experiments. It's the kind of truth we come to believe in from scientific method. And these truths can be very, very useful. Gravity, how gravity works. It's an objective truth. It's an empirical truth. We can test it. We can measure it. It works the same wherever you go. And we can replicate, and anyone can take the same experiment, replicate it, and find similar results. The problem is that where objective truths, where we've traditionally gotten them from in the natural world, physics, chemistry, simple biology, these tend to be what are called open systems, and we're looking at a fragment of the system and establishing an objective truth for that fragment. When we talk about what we're dealing with right now in the global pandemic, this is a complex system. Complex systems are closed systems. They deal with information feedback loops that create all these dynamics that change over time. And instead of looking at a fragment of a system, we're looking at the whole system. So what does that mean for truth? There are very few objective truths or empirical truths, especially in a novel virus situation, that we can point to and say, that is a truth. I'm going to give you an example that's not related to pandemic first. An objective truth is how a nuclear bomb detonates and explodes. That's physics. It can be tested and replicated, hopefully not often, but we can isolate exactly what happens when an atomic bomb goes off. How to contain nuclear weapons, the policy decisions of how to contain nuclear weapon, how to encourage disarmament, how to prevent armament or arms races, that is not an objective truth. That is not an open system. That is a very complex system. And the trick with complex systems is you can never experiment with them. You can never have the same system and run a test on it twice. Moving to the pandemic, we can't take Italy from beginning of March and run 2 tests with the exact same conditions. Even if assuming we could know all of the realities of Italy, we can't run it side by side. And so the concept of empirical and objective truth begins to break down for complex systems. Well, what does that leave us with? It leaves us with something called explanatory truth. And an explanatory truth is a causal argument that satisfies all the criteria you would expect from objective truth. It is evidence-based, it is rigorous, it can be at least somewhat tested, it's free of fallacy or obvious defect. These are the minimum requirements. But we also recognize an explanatory truth can never be empirically proven like an objective truth. So the benefit of an explanatory truth is it explains a phenomena you're seeing, and it includes the least anomalies possible. What I mean by that is that's kind of incorporating two terms. You may have heard of Occam's razor or Kuhn's paradigm. I tend to combine that when we talk about explanatory truth, and I'm going to get to how you can use this to evaluate news information. Occam's razor says, all else being equal, the simplest explanation is likely true. And Kuhn's paradigm is that when you have competing paradigms of theories in complex systems, the one with the least anomalies is probably a little bit better. Occam's Kuhn's razor, you combine them, it's the simplest theory with the least anomalies that can explain not only a current situation, but a future situation. So an explanatory truth, we're not saying this is empirically true or objectively true, but it is a theory that can explain the entire system with the fewest amount of anomalies. And by anomalies, I mean things you have to explain by bringing in other theories. This is the problem with conspiracy theories. They generate a lot of anomalies and get really burned down. So when you're looking at information, keep this in mind. A lot of people are taking information and looking for empirical truths. We will not know an empirical truth about this pandemic likely for months. The scientific process where it can work on the cellular level or the genetic level, that's going to take time. When it comes to policy choices, which we're going to talk about today, it may take years, and it's going to be an argument that lasts for a decade. Which was the better policy choice? What could have been done? But what we need right now in the moment are explanatory truths that help us understand what's happening right now and make decisions going forward that will be fruitful and useful in the conduct of what we do based on the truth we are assuming. If I assume that coronavirus doesn't exist and I go out and get infected, that has not been a very useful explanatory truth. It has failed to account for the fact that I actually got infected. And a lot of these news sources that you see, that we're going to dissect one that came up on Saturday, they fail on the standard of being a useful explanatory truth. They are loaded with anomalies. They don't give you any predictive power of what's going to happen next. They're really only trying to describe one point of the system. And what I want to go through first here is this came up on Saturday, and it was this argument being made. Well, first of all, before I get into the media literacy, let me catch up. A lot of folks have joined. Yvonne, good to see you. Welcome. Susan, glad you could make it. Tyson, good to see you. Hope you're doing well, Tyson. Hang in there. Rory, Eugene, Leah, Lisa, Gloss is here. Mike, Sinead, Lindsay, great. So there's a whole crowd. So let's go from the explanatory truth is the simplest theory that doesn't have fallacy, is evidence-based, it's rigorous, but also provides an explanation for what is happening and what will happen, and has the fewest anomalies available. So let's look at the fallacy that was brought up, or the conspiracy, or whatever you want to call it, that was brought up on Saturday. There was someone on the Ask Me Anything posted the article, or the abstract really, of this 80% of coronavirus tests are false positive. And the theory is, if all these tests are false positive, we shouldn't really worry. All these infection counts are off, and this whole thing's blown out of proportion. It's a giant fraud in the American people. It's just, you can see where the conspiracy goes from there, but it's anchored on an actual research paper that came out of China. And it was actually, when I dug into this, it was mentioned during a press briefing. So I actually listed down all the claims that were made in the last one. And I want to go through and use this concept of explanatory truth to dissect this media and improve our media literacy about this. Now, if you want to see the link, NPR did a write-up on this. The link's in the discussion. But the first thing that's important about this story is it's entirely resting on a research paper that was retracted from the journal that published it. It was published in a journal of medicine, and that got picked up. And 3 days later, the author, who is a Chinese professor at a university for pandemic studies, requested it to be retracted. This should be a red flag. All that exists out there on the internet right now is an abstract. And the abstract itself says withdrawn from publication. If you're not familiar with research papers, abstracts shouldn't be relied upon. If you can't see the paper itself, relying on an abstract is kind of like assuming that the Tinder profile picture is really them. Or if, like in Craigslist, I was on Craigslist and someone wanted to trade my peaches for their toilet paper and set up a meet in a shady part of town. And I just said, oh, that's fine. Let's go ahead and do that. Accepting an abstract without being able to dig into the article is basically taking the best case presentation they might make and assuming that's true. Now, when an author withdraws the paper, that means the author themselves no longer have confidence. So that tells me that the abstract itself, which is the best representation, probably isn't really going to give me much information. And in this specific abstract, a couple things. One, their methods. They did overview their methods. Their methods were based off estimates and deductions that then used a multivariate probability analysis to find a conclusion that in a very limited set of the population, 80% of the tests might be false positive in China. So let's go through that. They used estimates, which is fine. We use estimates, but estimates are not empirically valid. They're estimates, they're derived. They then use deductions, which is a logical process of deducing information from first principles, but that's again not empirical. And then multivariate probability analysis is like me rolling a bunch of dice until I find a result that's useful. That is not a very robust method. It's good for exploration. It's not too dissimilar to what we do in simulations, but it's not the same as being in a lab with beakers and scientists and finding an empirical result. And they withdrew that study. Now, there were a bunch of other claims that were made to sort of, dress up this. They claimed the author was imprisoned after the study. That's not true. He was available for an interview with NPR. It's in the link. They got a hold of him with a graduate student, tracked him down. There was a claim that because of this, all tests in the world should be considered false positive. Well, again, remember, an explanatory truth is free of logical fallacy. And the logical fallacy there is that all tests are coming from China. That's not true. Tests are developed and designed in every single developed country. Germany has one test. The US has a different test. China has its test. So even if it was true, that would only apply to Chinese tests and not US tests or other tests. And finally, remember, an explanatory theory is supposed to explain the system. This conspiracy theory that 80% of tests are false positives only explains one point. And the point it tries to explain is, don't worry about the infected. That large number you're seeing about infected, most are false positive, so don't worry. The problem with that is it ignores the other parts of the system that we are seeing now develop. The fact that the Army had to deploy mortuary and crematorium trucks to New York City. The fact that I get contacted by people on private message 10 to 15 times an hour who are explaining the consequences of COVID that are often occurring right in front of them. These are not parts of the system that can be explained by the false positive theory. If it was false positives, then we wouldn't be seeing this level of problem. My parents, their facility, there's now 6 deaths in that facility. That is not normal. Sure, there's 1 or 2 deaths a month. It's an elderly facility. These things happen, but they're now up to 6 in a week. And what we're going to show when we go through the forecast is the deaths are accumulating at such a rate. This is not normal. So from a media literacy standpoint, this entire presentation of false positives, even if we assumed it was right on everything that I told you about the abstract and the method was good and all that, it doesn't explain the entirety of the system we're seeing. It just tries to provide a point explanation, which falls apart when you consider the rest of the system. So when you look at information like this, don't just do your due diligence of, does it have a research paper that looks like it's sophisticated and have an abstract? I mean, a lot of people can't read research papers. That's not a bad thing. If you saw me approaching a car engine with a hacksaw and some duct tape, I'd hope you stop me from trying to repair that car. I'm not good at repairing cars. Lots of people aren't good at reading research papers. But even if so when someone throws a research paper, don't just believe it for that. But second, look at it and says, does it give us an explanatory theory that helps us address our conduct? This doesn't tell us anything about what's going on in the world other than to say, well, these infection tests, they're all wrong. Well, if they're wrong, what's causing the other effects in the system? And so, yeah, this is quick media literacy on that. I didn't want to get too far into it, but it was important because these types of disinformation are going to linger with us for quite a bit of time. And speaking of that, we're going to shift to our next topic. So let me see if there's catch up with folks. Rory, Eugene, Lisa, Gloss, Mike, got those. Sinead, good to see you. Catching up with folks. Okay, everyone's saying hi, Jeff. So maybe I'm strange. I would rather a false positive. Yeah, so there's a known false negative. False negatives are the danger, right? People who are declared that you're not infected and you are. Good comment there, Lisa. Yeah, so the people are talking about the false negatives. The false negatives is a known factor. It has been tested now and proven that there are some of these tests have false negatives. And the danger of that is you test that you're free of the disease or the virus, and then you go on and continue to spread it. But the specific thing I was talking about was a conspiracy that were false positives. The false positives were like, hey, 80% of these infections don't actually happen. It actually got, the reason this got out is it got into one of those White House briefings that I wish they would almost take off the air, because half of it is garbage and the other one quarter is watching poor Fauci like squirm like he's on a reality TV show and can't get off the island. So these things with these conspiracy theories can be dangerous because they create this disinformation. And there's another one that's coming up here that I want to share. All right, so this one I saw today. Ryan actually tagged me in a post. I want you to recognize this headline and this face, because what it's doing is it's asserting, and this guy is he has all the credentials, right? One of the ways to tell about these media literacies is he comes with the right credentials. He's a professor at a university with a fancy sounding title about biostatistician, and his assertion is we could beat coronavirus if we just dropped all restrictive movements, let everyone get sick except for the vulnerable. And basically, for those who have listened to me over the past couple of weeks or read some of the stuff I've done, he's reiterating induced herd immunity. Induced herd immunity says we're going to protect the elderly and the vulnerable. We're going to sequester them, but everyone else should go to school, should go to work, should go out and lick doorknobs and doorbells, because we're all going to be fine anyway. And we'll gain herd immunity, the fine, healthy ones of us, and that will protect the rest. And this is a theory we've seen over and over again, and it's appealing now. It's appealing because we've been in lockdown for, between 14 and 21 days, maybe a month, depending on where you're at. That's a long time to be locked down. We're looking for reasons to let us get out of lockdown. And this induced herd theory immunity was one of the 5 national responses. And it basically gives us the chance to beat this in a quick fashion and get back to normal, which we all want. The problem is, as we shift from this theory into the national response review, is let's take a look at the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom was the only country that bought into this theory of induced herd immunity. And I pulled these charts this morning, and on the left is our chart that calculates the actual infected. So if you look at this, it's a logarithmic scale going from 1 to 10 million now, days since first calculated infection. And what we have here is this blue line in the middle is the confirmed tested cases that we know can be altered by the availability of tests. So what we did is we took the deaths, which is this line, and we did a calculation to get an actual number of infected 20 days prior. The simple math is for every 4 deaths that occur on a day, 20 days prior, there are about 100 infected. This yellow line then calculates the deaths of infections to say at this point in time, we believe very strongly that there were over 100,000 infected because enough, several thousand of them died, that makes sense. From that, we then forecast 3 scenarios. The red is feared, the brown is a midpoint, and the green is hope. This represents a sort of the virus is accelerating, it's transitioning, and it's declining. And the gap between these two is probably the best we can get between confirmed tested and what's actually going on in the environment. Now, remember, the UK started this herd immunity. They did it. They abandoned it probably, I'm losing track of time, so maybe 2 weeks ago. And the reason they abandoned it was some of the reasons I laid out early. In a fast-moving virus, this concept of going into quick quarantine when you time it just before you fail to flatten the curve is very hard to predict. It's the nature of this virus with its lag times and information delays while it's doubling means we can miss the signals that we actually need to lock down and wait too long. And I think that's what the UK did, and they just abandoned it. Because you see here, they're having lots of deaths still. They've now got an infection rate, which is, the actual could be as high as several million. And you can see in this rate of change that the rate of change is just now shows the confirmed rate of change against the forecasts. Several of them are showing declines, but there is that risk that one of them is going to be this. So this entire theory of induced herd immunity that this professor is advocating it's not that we have experimental data. This is an experiment, but we have real world evidence that it doesn't work. So as you see this article come out, I'm going to clip this video and make a little mullet clipping so people can say, hey, what about induced herd immunity? And you can go back to it, use that. But let's go through some of the other responses. In Norway, we had an interesting experiment, or not really experiment, but a comparison between three countries. Two did lockdown and mobilization, which was the standard in Europe at a certain point, especially after Italy fell. Most countries went down to lockdown and mobilization. But Sweden actually did what I call business as usual. Sweden has what I would call a populist government, and these populist governments tend to be, and I don't want to speak too much on Sweden because I'm not informed of the local politics, but in general, the populist governments that have taken power in a lot of countries around the world are sort of anti-intellectual, anti-science, anti-evidence, cult of personality based. They're used to talking their way through things and getting things done by talking. Well, you can see here that on the right too, this is Sweden on the left, this is Norway in the center, and this is Finland on the right. All countries in the northern Baltic, so they're all neighbors. They all, not exact, but similar characteristics. And you can see the country that did business as usual is now doing significantly worse. It has a lot more deaths, and it has a large gap between its confirmed tested and its actual number of infected. The benefit of these charts is we don't just can tell who's doing bad, but we can see who's doing good. Look at Norway and Finland. Their forecast lines are almost converging with that confirmed tested line. And when you see a convergence like this on these charts, that means one of two things. Their testing is getting to a sufficient enough level that it's probably capturing enough of the details to match those forecasts. They also could be containing the virus, or a combination of both those. They also could be misreporting deaths. Remember, our forecasts and actual infected are based off the death count. So, you got to be careful that if they're misreporting deaths, that's going to throw things off. But I think with Norway and Finland, we can and the Baltic countries, we can assume they're reporting their deaths accurately. Same thing with Finland, a very close convergence. And so now these aren't experiments, but in terms of explanatory truth, well, we had two policies that, let's assume they're both evidence-based and rigorous, or whatever, or excuse me, business as usual was not. I'm sorry, I was thinking of induced herd immunity. This is a comparison between a good explanatory theory of mobilization and lockdown and a bad explanatory theory of let's just pretend nothing's happening. And you can see the result play out. And this is about as good as you're going to get in a crisis for explanatory theory. And it's not good because people are dying and suffering, but in terms of understanding knowledge, compare cases, take a swag on the results, and that's what you have. In the United States, we actually have a very interesting situation. The lack of leadership out of the White House and the failure to have a national plan, along with our sort of unique federal systems where state governors have a lot of power that doesn't exist in other countries, gives us kind of a 50-state experiment bed. Now, from a system dynamics, this is fascinating because you have 50 different states all trying different things that we can compare. From a I'm living in that country statement, it's kind of horrifying because all 50 states are coming up with their own ideas. And I want to be very clear as we get into these charts, even though these charts are abstract and isolated, and we can say Washington and California are doing better than New York, or Arkansas is doing better than Georgia, the actual reality is these states are connected by a large amount of lands and freeways. So it's not enough to have states that are doing well if other states are doing poorly. People move around. This disease is highly mobile. So we need to be mindful that even as certain states do well, we're replicating that and incorporating those lessons in the other states, and not just assuming that, hey, I'm good in Massachusetts, but New York's falling apart. That's not going to affect me. Well, there's a lot of land between New York and Massachusetts, and that's connects, and you can drive. So let's be careful. But to compare these are three states that all did mobilization and lockdown. So now this is looking within a certain explanatory theory at the state level. And I think what's important here is the timing. So mobilization and lockdown has a big timing component. And Washington, on the far right here, if you remember, was the one with the first outbreak. They had it the earliest. And they also, Governor Inslee put in the movement restrictive orders in early, I want to say it was either in late January or mid-February, one of the earliest ones out there where he jumped on, maybe it was early March now that I think about it, but he jumped on it more quickly than other states. In California, they were a little, I think it was the 17th or something when they put a state level lockdown, but as soon as they started getting cases, the major cities, the big population cities in the Bay Area went into lockdown as early as March 12th. So they went into lockdown very early. New York as a state did not even begin to go lockdown until March 23rd. So what you have here is, and I don't want to, Washington's a smaller state and doesn't have the same dynamics, but California and New York are both really big states with mega cities, Los Angeles and New York. Now, those cities are different. Their density is different. There's differences. I get it. But these are two very large, heavily populated states with at least one mega city apiece. And you can see the difference now of what happens when you do mobilization and lockdown earlier versus later. It makes a big difference. And you can see that in the time frame with where New York was failing to lock down. See how this incline is actually much steeper than California's? That doesn't look like a lot, but with exponential growth, that makes a lot of difference. And what you end up with is the difference between over 100,000 confirmed cases and between 1 million and many million actual, and a death count that's now over 5,000. And California, not only is it, the worst case scenario in California is over 100,000 infected, but the death rate is actually much, much lower. So we're seeing the difference now within mobilization and lockdown that favors earlier is better. And it's not conclusive. It's not empirical. Again, this is an explanatory truth. It's not as good as physics, but it's good enough to give us a predictive power of what we should do in the future. And this all plays into how do we react to wave 2? How do we inform ourselves for future waves? So let's take a look at the South. These are 4 states in the South. I picked the top 3 populous states and then Arkansas as a comparison. The ones on the top did business as usual. Again, they tended to have sort of populist governments who us worry will be fine. I didn't realize there was such a thing as asymptomatic carriers. It's Georgia, Florida, and North Carolina. And you can see in each of these, the business as usual approach has really, really harmed them. Look at how steep these inclines of growth are in all 3 of these states. I'm not saying they're going to get to New York levels, but their trajectory is where New York was several weeks ago. And some of these have very large cities. Georgia has Atlanta. Florida has Miami and Orlando. These are large. They're not as dense as New York, but once you get over 5 million, that's a big enough city to have a real problem if something gets loose. So these states, by failing to do anything, and I think they went into mobilization and lockdown. Georgia was and North Carolina were in April. Florida may have been late March or April and kind of wishy-washy on the beaches. I mean, they're very fuzzy on doing this and very late. So even though Washington provided an example in early March, these other states waited clear to the end of the month. And the problem is you see this throughout the South. And unfortunately, they're going to suffer for it. Wave 1 is kind of now on us. It's pay the piper time. It's not really that you can avoid the consequences of the decisions you made in February and March. It's too late for that. The question is, can we mitigate the maximum reach of it? And can we support while they're going through it? And what do we learn from it? And I included Arkansas here because Arkansas is a state that actually adopted the fire break model. And the fire break model was sort of, it's not a lockdown and mobilization, but it's a voluntary cessation of activities with heavy education, heavy awareness. They're not hiding the evidence. They're not trying to say, oh, this is no big deal. They're like, this is a big deal, but we're encouraging you to do the right thing. And what's interesting about Arkansas is it's the place where I've seen the fire break work. Look at these lines. Now, granted, Arkansas is a different state than Florida and Georgia. It's smaller population. I get it. I'm tracking. But just, it's an interesting case study because as a fire break, its lines are converging just like Norway and Finland. So if you've ever wanted to clip a video of someone saying, Arkansas, much like Norway and Finland, now's your chance. They've got a nice convergence going in, and it's because the governor has taken a very practical, pragmatic approach to educating the realities, doing lots of probably what I imagine are soft pressure tactics to get businesses to voluntarily shut down, voluntarily close down, and they've done a real good job of flattening this curve out, at least compared to the other southern states, which were kind of like, no biggie, we won't worry about it, and are now going to pay the price. Again, the problem with Arkansas is that these charts may be isolated and individual, but Arkansas has got Louisiana to the south and Oklahoma over on the side, and both of those states are having big outbreaks. Now, Oklahoma may come swarming into Arkansas in a flight mode, and that could swamp the Arkansas resources. So we'll have to keep an eye on that. And what this leads to, these state-by-state things, this is where the bad part of this 50-state experiment is the United States as a whole has failed its national response test. We tried the fire break, that didn't work. We tried the mobilization and lockdown, but states picked their own time. You know, now I'd say probably 46, 48 states are probably under some form of mobilization and lockdown. But I just pointed out a host of southern states that didn't even do it to the last couple of days. And it's been South Dakota is still resisting it. Wisconsin held a primary yesterday. Hello. And as a consequence, you see, unfortunately, the United States is still accelerating on a very steep upward climb. you can begin to see a little flattening in the confirmed, but let's remember, daily tests are not keeping up with the growth. So when you have a growing virus base and your daily tests are flattening at large numbers, that will show as flattening the curve. If you look at the forecasts of actual, though, we're in the 1 to 10 million range of infected, and it's still growing very fast. So I think, and you can see here the rate of change. If we take the worst case, we're still at 20%. That means doubling every 3 days. Even the best case is doubling every 7 days. Well, if you're already at a couple million people and you're doubling every 7 days, that's still a very, very large problem. We're going to continue to need more tests and more effort. And this is what we're seeing now in New York, which is a horrific situation. We're going to see swamp all the different areas that have failed to take this seriously. This is what I mean by pay the piper. We're going to see small rural areas that don't have a lot of resources struggle. We're going to see some large metropolitan areas probably have repeats of what's going on in New York. And the consequence of that, I've been sharing this chart to prepare people for what's going on in April through May. And this is a forecast of the many of the forecasts, probably 8 forecasts. 4 of them are from the Infomullet, 4 of them are from IHME, which is the University of Washington's Health and Medical Measurement Group. And they have a really good sophisticated simulation, whereas mine was an Excel sheet in early March. But you can kind of plot them there. And what it shows is on the left are the total deaths. And these lines, these sort of dashed lines, are the different forecasts. So you can see a range of forecasts. And the blue lines are actually milestones for people to get in their head. So one of the arguments is, well, you know, if people die in New York City, that's just normal, or this is just a normal flu season. I've put these milestones very specifically because there are mental milestones that people resonate with. Some of them may argue, hey, that's unfair. You're comparing a war. I'm like, yeah, but everyone knows the war. They can mentally picture that in their head. And we have already passed, in the last 3 weeks, the death total of all U.S. deaths from the global war on terrorism over the last 19 years. I'm talking 9/11, the Iraq War, and Afghanistan War. Not all deaths, but the U.S. deaths. This is the difference between coronavirus and anything else that someone will say, like cancer or strokes or diabetes. It's happening fast. It's all happening in this 1 month. In 3 weeks, we just beat the total of 19 years of war. And granted, these were, you know, in the traditional sense, you might call them limited wars or insurgent conflicts. They're not mass conventional wars, but there were a lot of deaths and suffering. We're probably on track to beat an average annual flu season by the weekend. Again, the flu season stretches out over many months. We have treatments, we have mitigations. We're now, when I looked at the numbers this morning, the rate of change over the last 5 days in the US for deaths, these are deaths now, was about 17%. That means we doubled our death count every 3 to 3.5, 4 days. So we're at 12,000 now. We could be at 24,000 come Saturday, maybe Sunday. We could be at, I hope not, 58,000 by sometime later next week. And these are where these forecasts start to go out on the steepness of how steep they rise. And the lowest ones here, the COVID-19 low and the Infomullet case 4, have us still well over the average annual flu season. The mid-range estimates, which are these two in the center here, actually will have us through May, beating, or not beating, but exceeding the total US deaths in Vietnam that took 9 years. This is the impact of COVID-19. All of this is going to happen in the next 40 days. This is a huge impact. And I'm not even talking about the ones who survive and the doctors and nurses and frontline responders who deal with the trauma and all the services that are going to be challenged by this. These are just the deaths. Now, the 2018 flu season was the worst on recent record. It was 80,000 deaths. So this is the next milestone we break through, and we may break it through with the midpoint by May. The trick is there, it was spread out over a year, and you know there were lots of treatment options. We may break it in a couple of weeks. Then we get to the high-end estimates, and we may actually see, this is probably less likely. I think the mids are more likely. We'll see. I've got a red line here matching up as we go through, so I'll update this so we can see where we're heading. The high ends get us over World War I, and the ultra high ends, my case number 5 and high and low, are so high I didn't even bother to put them on the chart. One of them tops out at 270,000 dead. The other tops at 405,000. That's probably very unlikely in the next 40 days. That may be more likely for the year. But to put that in comparison, 407,000 dead is not that far off from the total US deaths in World War II. Even in a year, that's a lot from a new disease that we only knew about come January. So let me pause here and go back and see, make sure everyone get some questions. While I'm going back, let me give a couple shout outs. Appreciate all the muleteers. If you want to become a muleteer and support the InfoMullet, you like these charts, you like this information, click on the link, www.patreon.com/InfoMullet. Also, big shout out to our data science muleteer militia. These are the ones who work behind the scenes putting these charts together. That we now have these charts. There's a link there. You can go look up any country, any state. You'll get these custom charts. You can download them as a picture, or you can download the CSV file and get the Excel. I know a lot of people out there are playing with Excel for the first time and say, what if we remove New York State? Well, now you can. You take the CSV file, you can do scenarios, you can do forecasts, you can share your results. So big thank you to the Data Science Muleteer Militia. And let me go through and catch up with where we're at here. So lots of people talking about tests. Good to see tests. Excellent conversation. Lori, the UK would like to hear more about herd immunity. Probably not. Mary, good to see you. Albert, good joining again. Okay. Lindsay's asking about the curve. So anywhere that Tennessee's projections are expected to be better, anything that's basing their curve off the confirmed number, I would be suspicious of until the daily testing rate increases. What you want to do is go into our charts, pull up Tennessee, and look at the gap between the forecasts and the confirmed. If that gap is small or it's converging, that's a good sign that you can rely on confirmed. If it's wide apart, that probably means your prediction of flattening. And look, there's a lot of people are looking for good news, and I understand. I'm not trying to create panic here, but like in New York, I'm seeing reports out there that like, hey, there were less people admitted to the hospital on these days than there were recovered. Well, yeah, because over last week we told people don't come to the hospitals because we can't handle you. There was an estimate this morning I saw that there are probably several hundred dead people in their houses right now in New York who passed over the weekend that we don't know about because they were afraid to go to the hospital. They heeded the advice not to go. They declined too rapidly and went into shock and couldn't go. So we got to be careful about these things like, well, hospital rates seem good, or the deaths in the hospitals were fine. We had a couple days there where there was a low death count in New York, but then it jumped up by 200. We are going to not know if we've beaten the curve until it's over. I would be very careful of sort of in-process reports when all this is moving fast. If you want to check out a state, again, look for that gap and confirmed. But again, I'd be very careful. If a place is having a breakdown, I would not rely on things like hospital admission rates because, you know, when you tell people don't go there, that's going to artificially depress it. Good to see Jody. Good to see you. What do you think is the basis for the White House's projection of 100 to 400,000 deaths over the course of the epidemic, and how does it? So Lucas is asking a good question. There was a, you know, I'm living in bonky years right now. Every day feels like 7, so I don't know how long it was. I think it was a week ago, maybe 2 weeks ago. The White House released an estimate that was 100 to 400,000 deaths, and that is credited with turning around Trump's mind. It has since been revised, or not revised, but they've said of those estimates, the 100 to 200,000 deaths are probably more likely. I don't believe those are the IHME forecasts because the IHME site, which is on the charts and sort of you can go look at, has an incredibly sophisticated methodology. You can see it, you can interrogate it, you can get all their data. The White House reports, when I looked into that, Lucas, no one can find the reports, no one can validate them, and no one can interrogate them. So those numbers are kind of like our swipe right on Tinder and just hope the profile picture is actually what they look like. We don't know. We have no basis for knowing whether that's a good forecast or not. At this point, however, if it got the president to move at all in the right direction, I'm okay with it. How it compares to our forecast, my forecasts were made in early March, and they were based off ambiguity analysis of the data coming out of China, accounting for certain error factors. I wasn't looking at hospital rates or ICUs or anything like that. I just took, and these are in our mental model article from, I think, March 2nd. And I laid out 5 cases with a variety of scenarios. And those showed between 13,000, the mid was 67,000, there was 105,000, there was a 270,000 and a 405,000. So it showed a range. Those models are not at all based off the White House. They happened before, nor are they based off the bed rate that IHME is looking at. IHME is looking at very specific timing windows and saying, what's the hospital ICU beds, et cetera, available at this point in this time when we think it peaks with this many patients. That they happen to look similar is more a factor of these are all S-shaped curves, and they're going to follow this S pattern because that's the nature of the structure of the virus. They also are sort of working with the same parameter estimates. Theirs is much more detailed. Mine was a swag, but they're kind of within the range. So 100 to 4,000 with the White House, even though we don't know what it said, it's probably on the upper high end of what we're looking at least as we get over 200,000, but it's certainly within the range of plausible. It's not inconceivable, but I never rely on something I can't get the details from. Can we use the tested count to give more weight on confirmed cases versus actual cases? Rory, not yet. I thought about bringing up the daily tracker of tests. Unfortunately, it's still lagging behind. It was between 95 and 113,000 all last week. It jumped up 150,000. Okay, that's movement. Then it dropped back down to 100,000. Then it jumped up to, I think, 200,000 yesterday. So it's struggling. It's very inconsistent. And that's bad because what you want is a nice consistent growth. So I would be reluctant to say that the testing is high enough. I've seen one estimate that we need 700,000 a day, and we're nowhere near that. We haven't even, I think we hit 200,000 a day for the first time once. Lucas, the conflicts on the Middle East and refugee crisis that result, I'll get that in another video. This probably isn't the right video for that. I want to get to questions because I just did a bunch of talky. Make sure I've covered all my, so Jennifer, good to see you. Renee, good to see you. So let me go to one last thing I want to show, and then we'll get to more questions. I may get to your question, but I have some questions that were asked on Saturday that I got information from. So one of the other things I wanted to show you is this concept of waves. We're in wave 1 now. So this entire death that I'm predicting and the forecast from IHME and the University of Washington in mind, it's all wave 1. It's between now and May 15th through June. I mean, it's not that the wave ends May 15th. That's just where the S curve begins to flatten out. We'll still see deaths continuing well into probably end of May, June. But this is a figure that was released by JP Morgan to illustrate this concept of consecutive waves. Wave 1, wave 2, wave 3, wave 4. As many waves as happen before there's a vaccine developed. And part of what they're showing is that these waves are a consequence of decisions to relax social distancing. And I actually linked a video. I did a systems theory explanation of how you can use systems thinking to interpret this. This is an attenuating oscillation with 2 negative feedback loops that you can actually understand what's creating this pattern and begin to see the system structure. But the long and short of it is there are 2 things acting in competition. The virus itself is trying to grow up to an infected level of the population. That's creating these upward trends on each of these waves. And then there is a choice made, a policy choice made to go into lockdown, mobilization and lockdown. That increases social distancing, reduces contact, and it reduces the infection. All along, we're increasing our hospital capacity. So the theory is we're instituting lockdown when we're getting close to hospital capacity. And if hospital capacity is increasing over time, which I do not agree is a lock solid assumption. I think we're gonna have a lot of time spent recovering our hospitals for what just happened, but this is JP Morgan's. As hospital increases, we'll be able to have smaller and smaller allow for sort of waves. But the problem is, from the systems theory standpoint, the number of oscillations you have in a pattern of this is determined by the time delay between these 2 competing forces. And the faster the one loop is, the more of its behavior you're going to see. So the oscillations are driven by this choice to lift quarantines, this choice to relax. And this is the big discussion. When are we going to lift? If you strengthen the feedback loop by decreasing the time it takes to make that decision, it's called making it faster or stronger, right? We are more quick to lift the quarantine because we're all sick of it. We're all done with it. We want to get our economy going. So we reduce the time and we lift it. From systems thinking, that's going to increase the number of oscillations because what it's going to happen is we're going to run right back into that epidemic growth pattern. And it's kind of like finding the right balance of when to lift is sort of like turning a knob for a shower when you're trying to get hot water and you're in a hotel. I travel a lot, so I have a lot of experience with hotels. The first thing you do is you turn it to the left and it's not warm enough, so you turn it to the left again. And then it gets really hot because you overheated it. And then you crank it all the way to the right and all of a sudden Antarctica is coming through you. That's because we're not spending enough time to slowly adjust it, wait and see. If we increase the time delay of how we turn that knob, we'd have less super hot and super cold, and we'd be able to sort of guide it into the temperature we wanted. The same thing applies for lifting these quarantines. The impetus to quickly lift quarantines is like yanking it too hot. And then all of a sudden, we're going to have another spike of infections because the virus is still out there. That's going to lead to another yank the knob back all the way to the right, mobilization and lockdown. And the practical aspect of this, the shorter we wait to announce a lift of quarantine and restrictions, the more on again, off again, opening and closing we'll have to deal with until the vaccine. So it really gets to a question of, do we have a longer mobilization and lockdown now and delay lifting those policies so that we don't have to do it as many times? Or do we quickly jump back in, do a bunch of stuff, oop, here comes the virus again, go back into shutdown? These are trade-off questions. There's no perfect answer. It does create risks on either one. The longer we stay locked down, the more economic harm we have. The quicker we open back up and close, the more likely we are to miss something and have another failure to flatten the curve. But how this matters personally. So when I shared this video, someone says, that's great, system theory, policy, yada, yada. How does this affect me? If you as a person are thinking, when should I break my own social quarantine or social isolation? And you have a choice between two dates, one of which is the option to leave and the other of which is required to leave, and the required is later. Let's say you have to do something at a certain point of time 2 weeks from now, or let's say not in the middle of the outbreak. Let's say in May 15th, you have the option to do something, but you could do it on May 1st. What systems theory and the structure of epidemics tells us is, if you're going to just do a rule of thumb, wait for later. Push back that decision to break your quarantine until you absolutely have to, because the longer you spend, the less likely you're going to have this cycling effect. Now, this is very simplified at the personal level. There's lots of factors I'm overlooking. You may need medicine, you may need groceries, you may have an appointment. There's reasons you may need to break, but I'm just saying, if you have the choice between an optional change in your routines that happens earlier, but it's voluntary because you're bored or tired, or you just want to get back to doing what you normally do, and a later thing which is required, I would err on the side of caution and go for the later one, especially as these governors may be yanking. You don't want to be outside on the streets when a governor has yanked the shower handle and all that hot water is coming down on you, because you're going to catch it. You're going to want to wait and see. Maybe they were too soon and they lifted it too early and now they got to put it back in place. You don't want to be in an exposed situation. With all this stuff with the virus, I'm trying to equip you with information that you can make decisions now that will benefit you 2 to 4 weeks from now when you're looking back retrospect. So again, there's a video in there on the system structure, but that's how this these sort of wave functions work. Let me go back and see questions. Renee, good to see you. Michael. Nathan, good to see you. So good questions. There's a lot of good discussion on testing. That's one of the things I love about the Molitor community. Great discussion on questing. And Susan brings up a good point. These tests are not uniform. It's not being administered the same way. They have different policies and protocols of who gets it and when. And just the sheer method. What's happening now is the FDA has an emergency approval waiver that just about anyone can make a test and push it to the market. This raises questions of quality, but it's a trade-off of, we need more tests. Let everyone go out and test. But the challenge is, which test do you have? Do you have the one that was very rigorously done in a lab and is robust? Or do you have the one that was put in place last week? We as consumers won't know until we get more information on it. And that will be a hard thing to get accurate information, because with all this stuff like the false positives and did it come from bats or a wet market or a biolab? We're going to be crushed with information. This is where we need to use those explanatory truth, that evaluation of what is an explanatory truth, to help us understand and make choices when this crush of information is coming at us. We're all going to have to get better at our own media literacy. There were some questions from last week. Before I forget, I wanted to answer them. Someone asked, because I did look into it, what about the internet? They're worried, will the internet collapse? Is it collapsing in some places? I didn't have good information. I went out and researched it, and Lawfare blog did a really good segment on why the internet hasn't collapsed, and it's called the Mother's Day principle. Now, if any of you are in IT or deal with networks and servers, I am on thin ice here, so feel free to push me down and like bury me under the ice if I get this wrong. Correct me in the comments. But what they're saying in Lawfare blog is the Mother's Day effect comes from phone services, and they would build the phone infrastructure to deal with Mother Day's calls, because that was the highest call volume in the year. So the theory is you build the infrastructure for the highest peak time. And in the internet age, that's the Netflix effect. You build your infrastructure for the best Game of Thrones, probably not last season, but somewhere in there where it's the highest rated streaming and everyone's on. And these hours are actually in the evening, 5 p.m. and later on the East Coast. And so when we move people work from home, the infrastructure that exists during the day is strong enough to support this surge of behavior at night. And now it's actually balancing throughout the day, because instead of it being surged at one time, people are hitting it at different times. So the big point that Lawfare Blog pointed out was not collapse of the internet itself, it's accessibility to the internet. The article goes into details. 20 to 30 million people have limited access to internet. And this is where we're getting all our information from, and all these great, community building Zoom and mask sharing information. If you don't have access to broadband right now, you're really living in a isolated place. Now, maybe that's relaxing and psychologically beneficial because you're not having people like me scream at you all the time, but you'd be missing out on Bonky, and that would be sad. No, but I think the question is not will the internet collapse, but how do we get information to people who don't have internet access in a reliable way? And that's probably the bigger concern there. The other question is, what is going on with other medical procedures? This is something that has been asked. I think Sabrina Joy actually asked both these questions, the internet one on Saturday and this one a couple weeks ago. Okay, so every day in the US, there are people who are going in life-threatening conditions with heart attacks, strokes, serious end-of-life conditions. And the question is, what's happening to those with the rise of the COVID cases that is consuming the healthcare capacity in these places? Now, first of all, we've talked already, all elective surgeries have been pushed off, they've been delayed, they're kind of preparing for these surges to come. But you can't elect a heart attack later. If you're in a heart attack, you need to go. There's an article, I think it's from the New York Times. We aren't seeing those cases come in, and that's concerning. So doctors are talking to each other. It's not a study, it's kind of a more anecdotal thing. But normally you would see in major metropolitan areas, you would see their measures. How many gurneys do you have lined up before the operating room? How many preps are you doing for these heart attack, stroke type situations? They're not seeing them come in. And that's concerning for two reasons. One, it may be that people are afraid to come into the doctors or the hospital with all of these warnings and the valid fear of contagion. They've already got something going on where they're going to be either immunocompromised or already have an underlying condition. Generally, the longer you wait to get emergency treatment, the worse your outcomes are going to be. The second is they may be having these situations and we're not catching it, and they're suffering the negative outcomes in their home. This is why we're not going to know the true sort of death count and impact of COVID until we can begin to understand what's going on in the apartments and homes of the people around us. This is why it's so important to have neighbors that can check in on you, or you can check in on them, or especially in these big areas, because the rate of decline in a stroke or a heart attack or even a COVID-related illness, if it's really bad, can be very, very fast. And if we're not getting emergency services, or people are thinking, I'm going to delay that call for an hour or two and see if it gets better, that can leave them in a very vulnerable position. So the answer is we don't know yet, but we know that those cases aren't coming in, or it doesn't seem like those cases are coming to the hospital. It's unlikely that we got lucky and no one's having heart attacks. They're probably still happening, but they're not getting the help they need. And that's going to be an additional impact. James, good to see you. What are your opinions on this? Mike Morrison asks, what are your opinions on the stories that are going around that the COVID-19 might have been in the US as early as November 2019? Does it really matter or change our current forecast? So this is one of these, this is a great point, Mike. This is one of these theories that explains a fragment of the system, but doesn't really help explain the whole system. And this isn't out of line from what the Oxford Study Group in England is talking about. The Oxford Study Group versus the Imperial College, they call it the tip of the iceberg. And the tip of the iceberg theory in general is this virus has been out earlier than we thought, whether it was in January for the Oxford study or November for your stories, Mike. It's out earlier. Most of us have already gotten it, and therefore we've already had it. It must have been so mild we didn't notice it. We're all getting herd immunity. Happy day. We're going to have some surges, but this will all be over soon and it'll be good. So they're actually testing that empirically. I talked about essential truths, objective truths, and explanatory truths. Iceberg theory is an explanatory truth. It's a theory that lets us make predictions about the future, but they're testing it empirically in the UK by looking for antibodies. If that theory is true, we can do serology tests and find antibodies in people who don't remember symptoms but are now immune. That will be proven soon. The problem is it doesn't match, at least with the rest of the behavior. It introduces an anomaly. Remember, I said that the rule of a good explanatory theory is it's the simplest theory with the fewest anomalies. And the anomalies the iceberg theory introduces is, okay, if this came in so much earlier, why is it only now that we're having the surges? Wouldn't old people or vulnerable people or people with underlying conditions have been infected in November, December, January? I mean, wouldn't we have been seeing this all along? And that's the challenge, I think, with the iceberg theory is the behavior patterns we're seeing of these surge rates are more in line with what I would call the imperial school theory, which is that, and that's the general theory most people are operating on. It's a novel virus. It's introducing in certain times. And once it hits a breaking point, it will crush the curve. We have a healthcare crisis. And their infection rates are larger than confirmed, but not anywhere near herd immunity levels yet. So there's two explanatory theories. The iceberg theory says, well, we've all been infected, but it doesn't explain why the deaths and surges are happening now. The other theory explains why the deaths and surges are happening now, and also explains that we're not all infected with it. So, it's kind of a weigh the two as when I look at terrorism and I'm trying to advise people on sort of violent stuff, I'd say go with the one that has the fewest anomalies. If you got to make a quick decision, and then test them all, keep testing them all. Don't dismiss them. Ishmael, good to see you. Yeah, lots of people, good discussion in the comments. Lucas, good point. The 10 to 30% negative false positive, or negative false positive. Whew, I'm getting there. The 10 to 30% false negative is coming out of studies in China. However, I've also seen, I thought I saw one from Europe, but I'll defer to Lucas because Lucas is working very hard on this. Jerry is coming in with a great comment that network companies have a vested interest in making people think bandwidth is much more limited than it really is, so they can create pricing tiers. Haha, we have uncovered the great pricing tier scam through the COVID virus and everyone hitting Netflix and Pornhub while they're supposed to be working. Lisa, I am still skeptical that the infrastructure is designed for constant use, but I am sure that they're running to make the required upgrades. This is still talking about networks. Let's see. Okay, Lisa's asking, have we seen any models around reinfection? Are they all based on initial infection, if that makes any sense? So good question, Lisa. This study, the Oxford study, the iceberg theory, to prove their theory, they're going out and doing antibody testing in a large population. Now, we've had two studies on this already. One was in China. There was an evacuated population of Wuhan that didn't have any symptoms, but they tested them anyway. They didn't find a lot of antibodies. So that was one knock against the iceberg theory. In Vo, Italy, it's a city in Vo, the entire town got tested for antibodies, and those who had not had the virus didn't show anything. So it's kind of, those are two knocks. This question on reinfection, it's really hard to say. I would expect we're going to get some hopefully good studies by June-ish. All of these studies, for me, one of my standard and criteria I use is it's a large sample size, high power, randomly controlled study with good p-values. And that takes time to put together. And I know I'm a broken record in saying this, but I'm going to keep saying it. A lot of studies coming out now are people pushing initial results, or the study in China that I don't know what they were doing, but they released it and withdrew it. I'd wait till probably May or June before we get really good information on reinfection. I would think we'd be seeing it. The problem is we'd be seeing it during the same time that everything's going to hell in a handbasket. So are we going to know that we're seeing it? Are people getting reinfected? And the first time was mild, so they didn't notice. The second time was severe, so they go in the hospital. Is that being counted once? This is why we need, and Lucas said 750,000. We're looking at creating a measure of how many tests we need, but we need a lot more daily tests because we can't just test diagnostically as people go into the hospital or and a coroner test to see if they're had it. We need to test probabilistically over a sample of the entire population. Think of an opinion poll, right? They can tell you, I mean, careful, I was going to jump into a Democratic primary debate here and make some angry people. But let's say hypothetically that there are two candidates running and one is named Sliden and the other is named Banders. And you do an opinion poll. You don't need to sample every single person to know who's going to win primary, if it's going to be Sliden or Banders, right? In a hypothetical Democratic primary. You only need to poll 1,400, 2,000 people if you statistically create it. We need to be doing the version of opinion polling with random testings in populations, because this is how we're going to find the reservoirs, the reinfections, all the things we need to know about before we can really be comfortable with how we're recovering from wave one. Right now, we're in a crisis. Our testing is so far behind and so inadequate. We're just doing diagnostic testing. But we need to amp it up to get to that probabilistic testing so we can say, like an opinion poll, we believe the opinion of this state goes for this person. It's not an actual count of every person. It's a count of 2,000 people and doing some fancy stats and saying, well, this is where we think they will break down by age, gender, all that jazz. So until we get better studies from antibodies studies and also probabilistic testing samplings, we're not going to know about this reinfection. And that really plays into the role of when do we lift and how do we lift the wave 1 restrictions. Guy's asking, is the antibody test widely available? Well, Johnny from last Saturday, anyone who was on last Saturday and remembers Johnny, he thinks the test is widely available. I don't know. I know there are studies going on, but medical studies to me do not mean widely available. They mean selected populations for very specific reasons to hit certain testing criteria, and not you can't go to CVS or something like that to get it. It will probably be wide-ranging antibody testing will probably be, I don't know, Lucas, jump in if you want. That's going to be, I would think, at least summer at earliest. I mean, I know the Melinda and Gates Foundation, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, announced like building 7 factories across all the potential vaccines. They're basically building a factory to produce each type of vaccine, knowing most of them are not going to be the right vaccines, but they're building the productive capacity now. So when we know what the right one is, we can quickly do it. I don't know if that's a wise idea with the antibodies, whether you can create spare capacity or have enough firepower to build all the variations of this. My guess is with the antibodies, there's too much variation. So you're going to have to wait until we know for sure. Then you're going to have to ramp up the production capacity to create these antibody tests. Then you're going to have to distribute it. And that is a very tough logistics challenge. Anyone who's familiar with logistics know that it's a lot easier to say, we're going to deliver 10 million packages to 10 million people than you are to get the trucks and the drivers and the trains and the tracking systems and who got the package and did they get another one. And are you hitting all the right places? That's a hard challenge. And I don't think until summer at earliest, we're going to see that. Any thoughts on the high altitude ventilator idea? That's the first I've heard about that, Ron. What is a high altitude ventilator? Is that something that is that like a Bob Marley high ventilator, or is that like a Colorado Springs high altitude ventilator? What kind of high altitude are we talking about? Is this a specific type of ventilator that is? Explain more in the comments. I haven't heard about it, so. Yeah, Guy, I figured you might know about logistics. I avoided singing the logistics song because that would probably, right. Yeah, good. I love this description here and I've seen it from a couple people, Glass, Guy, and Mike Morrison. Amateurs talk strategy, professionals talk logistics, right? I tell you, my experience, like this is kind of like fighting a war. And I know those analogies are overused, but my experience fighting a war was nothing like you see in Hollywood. It's not like one person goes out and makes the big difference and be the hero. It is literally you have this raging wildfire coming at you. And all you have is 1 cup of water. And all anyone has is 1 cup of water. And you look around and there's people pouring their water on the ground to see what it says on the bottom. There are some that run up and just throw it in the fire. There are others just standing around. And the biggest thing you do in a war fighting effort is not the heroics of the water. It's organizing the people and all their little cups of water to go up as a group at the right place at the right time to all throw their water at one spot, which in theory is the right spot. So these logistics questions, when we talk about warfighting or pandemic response, coordination of logistics is vital. And it's almost as important as the science itself. I mean, we look at the scientists in the lab coats and the chemical labs, but this is going to come down to hands and feet people delivering logistical capabilities. And this is one reason I get really nervous about the patchwork effect that we're seeing with the states, the failure of any national coordination. And there's a double-edged sword here. I mean, the national coordination might be by Jared Kushner, so be careful what you wish for. But the logistics coordination, we have the ability as a country to generate massive amounts of logistics effort, but it needs some sort of coordination, prioritization, a little bit of oversight, something to tell people, kind of guide them in certain ways. And that oversight needs to be evidence-based. I'm almost kind of glad right now that we don't have a national plan, because I look, if it was, it would be, deploying bottles of hydrochloroquine or whatever that stuff is to every household. It wouldn't be evidence-based or science-based. So we need the scientists to get us the information. That's the strategy. The strategy is, here's the antibody test, here's the vaccine, here's the things you need to do to be safe. But then, to Mike's point, logistics wins wars, right? Getting that information out and distributing it massively, that's going to be the big challenge of our post-wave 1 recovery, and what I hope we're focusing on over the summer. Everyone's still talking about internet. That's good. Paul, any reliable forecasting on what's going on in Africa, looking at the John Hopkins site? Things look quiet. So, Paul, great question. The problem with developing countries in this virus is they don't have the infrastructure or capabilities often to get massive amounts of testing kits. So this looks quiet is probably a false reading because they're not able to test as much. Likewise, when someone dies, they're not necessarily classifying that as a COVID-19 death. Remember, our forecast that we use to compare against tested is based off death rates that are assumed to be COVID. If they're not reporting death rates, like Bangladesh has probably been underreporting death rates, that affects our forecast. We're seeing a lot of secondary and tertiary effects in different, because Africa is a huge place. So we have North Africa, Western Africa, the central areas, South. We're seeing a lot of movement now in North and Central Africa, and a little bit in the West, where countries are beginning. I just saw Sabina Ahmed posted a great video, and I can't share it because the guy's swearing all the time, but it's a Liberian police officer almost crying into his dash cam, swearing at parents to get their children inside. That's in Liberia. That's west coast of Africa, right? So, wait, am I thinking Liberia? Okay, I want to make sure I'm not mistaking it with other ones. That's a real human emotion. It's a real human response. They're feeling this in those areas. They're going through lots of reactions. But are we getting tested numbers? Can we see it on the John Hopkins site? No. The other problem is if you go sort of in the mid-central Africa and the Sahel region, so, here's the Mediterranean coastline, Sahara, and you drop down in the Sahel, that entire area has a really active insurgency that I've been watching for a long time. And if you remember in January, I made this kind of Vogue, I'm scared about something. It was about that, the Sahel insurgency. You have Al-Qaeda and ISIS, local insurgents fighters. They're just ripping apart that area south of the Sahara. And so you're losing a lot of government institutions and infrastructure right as this contagion goes through those areas. So I would say that I think Africa is getting hit by this. It may, like everything else, it may be timing effects. There may be lag times, but I think it's happening. We're just not capturing it in the test. Lindsay Franklin, I've seen people say patients are dying of unrelated causes and COVID-19 is being listed as a cause of death. This seems patently ridiculous to me, but there's some seed of truth here. Do you know where this idea came from? So Lindsay, there's two sources of this idea. One is valid and one is conspiracy theory. The valid idea is that the symptoms of COVID death can look like pneumonia. It can look like a flu-related pneumonia. And we think about flu and influenza and people are like, oh, well, flus go on and people die from flus. And so there's a valid kernel of truth in this. All good conspiracy theories have it, is that, yeah, in the hurry of when you're dealing with, I mean, New York had, I don't even want to know what it was yesterday, but the day before that, something like 730 deaths in a day. When you have that many deaths in a day, you can't do an autopsy on every single one. They back up. And so there may be more, what I called on Saturday, looks like a duck, quacks like a duck, walks like a duck assessment. And that may include some that aren't COVID. But the other thing is, remember the circumstances. If someone drops in a couple hours from being healthy, maybe they're elderly and have an underlying condition, they're healthy, they got a cough, they're declining in a few hours, and now they perish. We know that track pattern is likely to be COVID. Likewise, the progression of it, we're pretty good about it. And this thing with the influenza, the influenzas end, and they're usually ending about this time. So the CDC actually has monthly charts that you can go in and look at the reporting, the surveillance of influenza, and it shows when influenzas normally end and when they're ending this year. And where the conspiracy theory comes from, so the second half of your question is the conspiracy theory is they look at these charts, someone grabbed them because I don't think these people researched it on their own. They grabbed the charts and said, oh, look, influenza deaths went down just as COVID deaths went up. That's probably nefarious. Well, influenza deaths always go down at this time of year. You go look at the history, they're declining. And so a natural decline happened to coincide with the rise, and it's kind of like a shift. But I think we're getting good enough now to distinguish between COVID cases and influenza cases. Because remember, we're out here in internet land and we see a paper or we see a chart. The doctors who live this, they're seeing hundreds of patients over and over again, and like emergency responders. My guess is an emergency responder at this point is probably almost as good as a test on whether this patient has COVID-19 or not, because they've seen it so many times that they get this heuristic in their head. So obviously there's probably going to be a margin of error, But at the rate we're talking about, 12,000 deaths now, 24,000 deaths potentially by the end of the weekend, 56,000 deaths, worst case scenario heading into late next week. I don't think there's no we're getting past the area. When I put up that chart, let me share it again so people can see, because this is going to be something that will really, I think, blow through a lot of these conspiracy theories. A lot of these conspiracy theories are contexted on comparing it to something we know. And your average flu right here is right here at 18,000 a year, right? So all those flu deaths over a year, we're going to pass that probably later this week, maybe early next week. So it's hard to say, even if we don't know each individual case is exactly COVID or not, it's hard to say that the average flu in a week did more than it ever has done as an average. And even the recent worst case flu, the 2018 flu, and this is in the last 10 years, I think, had 80,000 dead over a year, right? If we go through in some of these scenarios, we're going to be cresting that in 40 days. So you can begin to say it's probably not just the flu, because the death rate is so much higher than in a concentrated time than the flu has ever been. So let's not, let's get rid of this nonsense and share the charts and kind of inform people that is probably not a valid concern. Good questions. I love the scientific folks in my things. I think we got, be careful when you come into the info mullet, because it's not just me who has an advanced, I have the least advanced science degree. My main claim to fame is staying at a Holiday Inn Express before I went into quarantine, staying at a Holiday Inn Express. But we have some actual lab technicians, PhDs, Masters of Science. So everyone here is a pretty good crew for smart. So, so you can pretty quickly and easily repurpose one. Good. Thank you, Lucas, for answering that. Thank you for the clarification, Ron, that they're using the wrong sentings on the ventilator. That is outside my lane. I don't have any knowledge. I can barely operate the mouse I'm holding. So I'm going to defer to someone who knows better about settings and ventilators, because that is outside my league. Jan, good to see you. Guy asks, assuming that 2 of the 7 factories go into production with vaccines, is there a good chance that the other 5 can be converted into something useful at lower cost than building useful things from scratch? Probably. I mean, it's Bill Gates' money. Have at. And this is where I think we need to be encouraging, incentivizing what the White House is doing right now. Everyone loves this Defense Production Act, and I'm actually terrified of it, because the people who are wielding it are Jared Kushner and President Trump. Right. So when we talk about ventilators, there are companies who make ventilators and know what the hell they're doing. They, are very experienced at it. What President Trump did, though, is went to General Motors, because that's a publicly recognized name, and they made the mistake of stepping forward in line. They voluntold themselves and said, hey, we'll make ventilators. If you're ever in the military and they say everyone step forward and everyone steps back and you're the last one standing, bad place to be. General Motors now was on the hook, and Trump started beating them up with this Defense Production Act. Meanwhile, the companies that actually make ventilators are like, hey, wait a minute, we already know how to make them. What we need are subcomponents. We can do the finished assembly of ventilators at much higher speeds, but what we need are subcomponents. But what President Trump did with the Defense Production Act is force GM to make more ventilators. They don't know if they can make ventilators. This is new for them. So you're having this kind of, we need incentives, not force. Force generally doesn't work even when applied in the best of circumstances. And when it's applied by people who aren't using evidence, it really creates counterproductive. If you're a potential ventilator maker, you're going to look at General Motors and say, well, I'm going to work on it, but be very quiet about it. I'm not going to get on the president's radar because I don't want to have the Defense Production Act used for me. Same thing happened with Canada last week. Fortunately, it got worked out. But at one point, Trump used the Defense Production Act at 3M to say you will not ship any of your N95 masks to existing contracts in Canada and South America. Well, Canada's having an outbreak too. Brazil's having an outbreak. Argentina, Chile, these countries need these N95 masks. And the danger is he's just thinking, again, fragments in system, explanatory truths, right? A fragment of a system is not sufficient enough for a decision. You need to consider the whole system. President Trump's thinking, well, we need the N95 masks here. He's not thinking that the way we make the N95 mask is we get components from Canada and countries in South America, and we trade. So when he uses this Defense Production Act as a club, he creates a real problem in that it's sort of like free trade breaking down. Barriers go up. And I was reading about this in Europe. It's not just President Trump. Germany did this where they basically on one of their testing, they refused to ship or provide their companies, and it created barriers across the European Union. This caused challenges right in the midst of March, where when they needed was most cooperation. The best way to fight a pandemic is global. It's regional. It moves around. As I said, it moves around with people. The best way to fight a pandemic is working together, and you need incentives so that Bill Gates can build his 7 factories, and maybe Elon Musk will build something that probably won't work, but sounds cool, and will get a lot of hits on Twitter. But you know what? Everyone does something, and then we kind of coordinate the priorities to say, well, what we need are factories for vaccines, Mr. Elon Musk, and not like a vacuum tube way of shipping them. That's nice, but let's focus on practical. So I think the government can play a good role in oversight and sort of nudging, but we have to be really careful with these Defense Production Acts going along. Good discussion on Africa and previous tests. Pneumonia. Yeah, the reason, Lucas and Guy, the reason I tag in on pneumonia is in Bangladesh, Sabina was working, and we found that there was classifications as atypical pneumonia where it probably should have been COVID. Yeah, Ryan is confirming, heard from clinicians, you can pretty much look at a patient and diagnose him with him. Look, my sister's an infectious disease specialist in Alaska. She's been doing nothing but working nonstop, preparing the hospitals for this, and now she's dealing with their cases. My guess is by, she could be like, like a horse whisperer. She could be a COVID whisperer by the end of next week, just because you see it over and over again. You begin to realize what it is. Schrodinger's virus, yeah, Schrodinger's virus, where a person has both influenza and SARS-CoV-2, maybe a Schrodinger's virus. And Lucas. So we're at 2:20. I hope the questions answer good. I'm going to scroll through, say hi to folks. By the way, if you're just tuning in and you want to support what we do, bring more context to the news, www.patreon.com/infomullet. It's our muleteer subscriber. You can become a muleteer. For those who are senior muleteers, I'm going to put together a calendar invite for a Zoom session so we can have one of the social things we talk about for the senior muleteers. That will be coming out in a couple days. I'm sort of catching up with trying to keep on top of all this stuff. But if you want to support the InfoMullet, become a muleteer. It's $5 a month. Senior muleteer, only $10 a month. We really appreciate all the support. It helps out a lot, and we're trying to keep pace with what's going on. And we do talk about other stuff. Those who have watched me for the last 20 years, economics, political economies, foreign affairs, we get into all that stuff now, but my priority right now is equipping people for coronavirus, because that seems to obviously be the biggest. I'm going through and looking for more questions. Haven't seen any. Here we go. Yeah, Leah, my dad was a logistician for CENTCOM. They would test various responses to potential circumstances. Leah, that's actually what I do with my simulation. So when I run a simulation, the reason I have a simulation is I can run multiple scenarios, and we can make the system respond in different ways, and we can do it by careful thinking and architecture, or we can do 10,000 permutations of the data within it and just say, okay, brute force it. These ability to test contingency scenarios, a single system can manifest many different contingencies. It can manifest different behaviors. And that's why complex systems are tough. The same system, if something else happened, a counterfactual, can go down a completely different path and manifest a different behavior. Planning for these things, that's why I think having a little bit of overage of capacity isn't a bad thing right now. You're going to have some waste, but you're building for multiple contingencies. Valeria. Canada is the sole producer of one sort of extremely good filter paper, but is more of a round robin mass, go north, other stuff. We also send healthcare workers. Yeah, Canada's not out of the woods yet, but they've got some interesting data. It's sort of in a tenuous spot, but they have done a lot of work. They've been a lot better, I think, at communicating this and having a more consistent national response, although Ontario's been a little sloppy. The problem right now is Montreal. These large cities, what we didn't see in Europe as much. See, in Italy, it was in the northern regions, more in the rural areas. New York City was the first hyper large city to really get hit bad by this. And so you look at cities like Atlanta, Montreal, Los Angeles, Houston, Chicago, Detroit. Well, probably not Detroit anymore in terms of large population, but any of these large, high population cities, as we get into it in the United States and Canada, and in Europe too. I mean, it's going to be a real challenge to see, can we contain this and how do we contain it? And it may be more of that growth and collapse that I talked about way back in January, that the virus just runs its course. And that may be what's happening in New York. What do I make of the Iceland data? Reminder to give me a little more context, because I do have a pretty good memory, but the Iceland data was they tested a bunch of people and found that up to 50% of them were asymptomatic carriers or something like that. Well, first of all, culturally in Iceland, no one's going to admit they have symptoms. They're all like, hardy. But I think it's a good point that we don't know how many, this gets back to this two explanatory truths that we're fighting with. Is the virus an iceberg theory, that it is so prevalent and so widespread that everyone gets it, but it's mostly mild? So the surges we're seeing are just the lingering effects. That bodes well for herd immunity. It bodes well for lifting quarantines, and it bodes well for these healthcare collapses not happening frequently. On the other hand, the other thing is that this is growing as a virus traditionally grows, and the iceberg theory isn't holding. It's hitting areas in different times, and what we're seeing is natural growth in those areas at points in times. Iceland's a unique case. It's a small country with a very small population, 300,000. And they have a lot of social practices, especially during winter, that, they all go out and share the spa, they're in contact. So I don't know if that's a irregular effect related to Iceland, or we're going to see it. As we get more sample studies, we're going to see if the Iceland effect replicates. Yeah, Bonky needs a mask. I've been trying to figure out how to make a mask for Bonky, but I have very limited materials here. Tyler, good to see you. Okay, pausing for any more questions. Again, we'll do another one of these on Saturday, 6 p.m. I have added all the events now to a calendar through May 20th, so hopefully people can see them. Again, we're going to clip this, edit a little bit of the dead end up front, put it on YouTube. This will be available on Facebook, so if you're getting to it late, you can still see it. All the charts and links are in the thing, and I've got 2 articles coming out. One is the written version of this national response overview, where I show the different kinds of responses and some comparisons between countries. The other is the fourth in the 4-part series of forecasts, which is really about how we recover from wave 1. Let me scroll up, make sure I haven't missed anyone. Say hello to everyone. And thanks everyone for joining. I appreciate it. By the way, if you haven't shared this yet, even if that's the end, go ahead and share it. I appreciate it. Your friends will see it and they'll watch it from the beginning and hopefully get some good information. I am trying to, if you like these media literacy, I'm going to try and clip these and put them as mullet clippings on YouTube. So they're short 2-minute pieces of how you react to a certain piece of media disinformation. Just looking, good discussions, like the discussions, but just looking, make sure. If I've missed your question, throw it in at the bottom. Just checking through the, let me give another shout out to the data science multi-tier militias. They're the folks who makes all these charts possible. They're pulling data every day from the World Health Organization and for the country level data, and the COVID-19 tracking group for the state level data. So now any country that WHO tracks, it's over 160. You could put in the Holy See if you want and look at the Holy See, see how the Vatican's doing. Everything's in there. You can bring up the charts. You can bring up the states. The only requirement now is, because we're doing this comparison, there have to have been 5 deaths in that state. And I know Rory in Hawaii, they either didn't have 5 deaths or just got to it. So there may be a few states that are missing. That's because we don't begin doing our calculations until we have 5 deaths in the record. And that's to avoid noisiness in the data. The good news though, is if you're less than 5 deaths, you're doing pretty well right now. And 5 deaths comes pretty quickly, usually, as we've seen these life cycles play out. Same on the country. You're not going to see a country if it has less than 5 deaths. Great discussion on the antibodies and the testing. I appreciate you all, folks. Todd, good to see you. Todd Sharp. Do you think there's a point in time where it'll be decided that it's more important to the economy going versus saving lives? Yeah, so I mean, everyone doesn't like that question, but I think it's important because the economy's lives too, right? It's not profit. People are mistaking the economy for profit and saying, well, it's not worth profit versus lives. But the economy is also the production of food, the production of servers, the ability to pay mortgages that keep rent going. And I think what it comes to is there's going to have to be some things we can relieve with support. So let's take one slice of the economy that's really important to people: rent, right? You have to make income to be able to pay rent for the landlord to pay their mortgage so that no one gets evicted and the financial system collapses. If the mortgages start defaulting and the financial system collapses, what could be an exogenous shock recession or depression, excuse me, that's a V-shape, I'll put a picture up later, but you have a V-shaped because it's an external factor. But if we lose credit and the credit system collapses, it becomes a very long recovery that takes many more years. So there's a vested interest in keeping this whole thing from collapsing. The question is it better done with support through the government, through a federal program or relief program, or is it important to lift the quarantine and allow the normal economy to function? And this is going to be, these policy questions have to be analyzed individually. So let's take mortgages, rent, and all that. If we say we need to lift the quarantine so people could earn income and they can pay their rent, well, the rent goes to the mortgages and the rent landlords have to pay the mortgages or they default and the mortgages need it. Now, a way of solving that without lifting the quarantine is if the Federal Reserve backstops the loan guarantees on the mortgage. We've already seen this once. You know, when this happened in 2008, 2009, it was a moral hazard. People were gambling. They were playing with dirty money. They were doing all sorts of stuff in the financial market they shouldn't have been doing. They got caught. I actually am against the TARP bailouts and have been since they happened, but water under the bridge, or a few $1 trillion of water under the bridge. But this is an exogenous shock. No one plans for pandemic. Restaurants facing eviction, they didn't plan for a pandemic. There's not the same moral hazard here that like, haha, you'll skip on your rent in the future because you're expecting another pandemic. That'll sort itself out. If the Fed backstops the mortgage and the mortgage companies say we are now providing relief top down so that the mortgage companies relieve the mortgage payments on the landlords relieve the rent payments on the tenants, that's the right way to do it. I see a lot of states starting, well, renters don't have to pay rent. If you don't take care of the landlords, they're going to default on the mortgages and you've just created another problem. This is a situation where I think it's probably better to use a backstop than it is to risk a quarantine removal too soon. Not all parts of the economy can function that way. Not all parts. I mean, there are going to be entire business sectors wiped out. Restaurants. Do we open up the quarantine so that restaurants can survive? I mean, I know everyone's ordering delivery and that's good, but it's just a fraction of what it is. And restaurants are thin margin businesses anyway. There's an argument that could be made. Restaurants employ a lot of people. So let's keep the quarantine in place and we keep the economy turned off. And now that entire restaurant segment is gone. You've just made sure that that group of people are now even further in the hole with the overall unemployment, and maybe instead of 25% and it decreasing over time, it's going to be longer. So these are serious decisions. I don't buy into the, well, we should just always veer on the side of people, because a political economy is people, right? All the math and the numbers and the money, it gets down to people. And you can't keep an economy stalled forever. The trick is it's happening all around the world, is at these economies. So I think we're going to have to look as much as we can at backstopping where we can. And earlier, Todd, I gave an example of lifting the quarantine too soon actually means you just have to put it back in place again as you get an infection. So I think if as an economist, I'd rather be a little slower and remove the first mobilization and lockdown later. So err on the side of caution. That gives us more time for research, more time to understand herd immunity, antibodies, and stuff like that. And then backstop the pain, use relief to minimize the pain of that, then lift it with the confidence that that quarantine won't have to be reinstituted in another 4 weeks. You know, the economy also functions on confidence. And if businesses begin to think that even if you lift a quarantine, 2 weeks later, you're going to have to go right back into it, that will affect their comfort in doing the things like hiring workers and bringing things back together. So I would say for wave one, we probably want to err on the side of caution and delay that as, you know, and I'm thinking probably till late May or June at the earliest. That people, and another thing, psychologically speaking, the death rate I'm expecting or forecasting, very few people are going to want to open the economy after the psychological shock they're about to go through in the next 40 days. We're about to see anywhere from 60,000 to 140,000 people die. You know, it could be a lot less, it could be a lot more, but that's the mid-range in the next 40 days. From an unusual, on top of everything else, I know cancer causes this and all this, but this is on top of that, and it's all in 40 days. That's going to have a psychological factor where I think there's going to be reluctance. We may have to make a good argument to open the economy from a population and politicians who are kind of in shell shock with what just happened. It depends on your local area too. Certain areas that don't go through the flattening the curve, they may be like, hey, what's all the worry? But if you're New York City is going to be recovering from this for months. I mean, this is not going to be easy, just like turn it back on and go back to normal. Let's see here. Other questions, Mike, and not paying out all the additional unemployment checks. Those funds are coming from somewhere else, somewhere. Yeah. So unemployment, interestingly enough, one of the early economic forecasts, it's on the blog, Pocket Full of Posies. I pointed out that a lot of the states they have, like any insurance, they have a fund for unemployment insurance. They haven't been paying enough into it, so they're not prepared to withstand a shock like this. They're going to have to borrow that money from the Fed. It's not a case where unemployment checks won't go out, but states are going to have to borrow that money. And that's going to put the states in worse financial position than they were already. Yeah, Lucas makes a good point. States don't have the power to help out banks and mortgage holders in the way they need, but they do have the power to stop evictions. That's a fair counterpoint, Lucas, that governors are doing what they can, but the action needs to come from on high. Jennifer brings out, in the UK, government has backed business interruption loans to small businesses, but the banks aren't playing ball, even though the taxpayers bailed the banks out. What's your take? Not familiar enough with the United Kingdom situation to know the banks intimately there and what's going on. It sounds like dirty play. If you get something with an expectation to use it and you don't use it, that's probably bad. And as a system theorist, I would say look at behavior over time. You may think at a point in time, haha, we got a little extra. But as behavior over time, everyone's going to be looking at you. And I tell you, during pandemics, a human reaction is to look for scapegoats. Like those 4 senators who were caught using insider trading, they're mud. Banks that play fast and loose with the money they were given to help people but don't help it, people are going to be looking for blood because there's a lot of deaths associated with this. As bad as the financial recession was, to the extent there were deaths, they were sort of, from depression, from inability to get healthcare or negative outcomes. So, I mean, they were really hidden. This is a high death event. High death events bring forth a lot of visceral emotions. So I would not be advising anyone to play fast and loose. Now, in the US, I know there are similar programs. There's a payroll protection program and there's a emergency disaster loan. And those are the government shoving money through the banks into the small business sector to keep them afloat. And I've worked with banks because I'm a small business myself. The banks are being very receptive for doing this. Their view is, hey, the government's giving us money and we can give it to our people and we can keep them as customers. So, I mean, your mileage may vary in the US, but I've been having calls with bankers and it's a credit union. So it's not like I'm not calling Goldman Sachs or anything, but a local credit union. They're eager to help me. I'm eager to work with them. It's working out pretty well. Obviously, a program like this has logistics problems. There's that logistics again. The rollout has been kind of botched and it's been a nightmare of web page applications and server crashes, kind of like the first American Affordable Care Act rollout, but that will work itself out. So I think what I'm seeing in the US is the banks, at least on the small business side, are willing to push that money through to where it's needed. And I mentioned earlier, the Fed did an interesting thing here in that they're backing the banks at up to $1 trillion a day or $10 trillion a week. This is very important for people to understand. That's a guarantee. No banks have taken them up on this offer. If you think about what happened in the financial collapse, is the Fed paused and a bank collapsed. There was Bear Stearns and then the other one in August, I think. Maybe Bear Stearns was the second one, but there were 2 banks that collapsed. So all of a sudden, the market lost confidence in the banks. And that created a credit crisis, and credit recessions last forever. When you lose confidence in credit, no one has credit to reinvest when this ends. It makes a lot longer recession. What the Fed is doing now is, having learned from that, at least in the US, they're backstopping the banks to say, look, no problem with the banks. There's not going to be a credit collapse. It's all good. And by doing that, they actually may have prevented the banks themselves from having to worry about collapsing. It's a move where, by offering $1 trillion guarantee now that I'm not actually paying anyone out, I prevented the need from having to backstop the banks with this kind of TARP bailout money that's caused so much consternation. Now, Jennifer, I know you're in the UK is now separate, but for those who are in the European Union, I have read this morning that there's been a real challenge for this kind of financial coordination. So the European Union has an added complication of their member states all use the same currency, but have radically different economies. It's kind of like the only example in the US is Puerto Rico's economy is so structurally and fundamentally different than the rest of the United States that things like minimum wage laws there don't make sense and cause negative effects where they're probably too low in the US. And so, when you normally, between countries, if you have a weaker economy, you make your currency weaker so people want to buy from you, and that helps bring business in. That maneuver is prevented in the European Union. And so you have all these countries now that they share a common currency, but don't share a common fiscal policy. And what's happened in the last 2 weeks has been this effort to sort of create the backstop infrastructure, because there's several European economies, Portugal, Italy, I think Ireland, Greece, and Spain, at least those were the ones coming out of the financial crisis that had really difficult times. And I saw Sinead on here. Maybe Sinead, you can correct me on Ireland, but they had very difficult fiscal problems of high debt loads, high debt to GDP ratios. Their credit default swaps were off the chart. The insurance was high, and there was a fear they would collapse. And that caused a lot of consternation between Germany and France, which are sort of the lenders to support that, organizing around the rest, to bail out those countries and help them. And Greece wasn't exactly thrilled with the terms that got put down on them. So there's been a lot of bad blood in Europe over this dealing aftermath of the financial collapse. And that's coming to bear right now in the last 2 weeks as they get together, the finance ministers, the health minister of the European Union. I don't know the exact title, but I think it's the highest, kind of like our equivalent of the head of the Health and Human Services, or maybe the CDC, resigned last night or the night before because the European Union wasn't getting together on this sort of bailout financial, and it was causing, he had lost confidence and faith. Now there's rumors of internal politics, that he'd overplayed his hand. I mean, there's always some accusations, but the fact that European Union does not have a coordinated financial response, shock and surprise, the US is ahead of the game in this standpoint. We are now in a better shape economically than Europe is, at least from that perspective. Ryan asks, psychologically, is that number of death large enough to impact all of us? Well, we all know a guy that died from it at that number. 7 degrees of separation says you may not know a person, but you'll know a person who knows a person, or at most a person who knows a person who knows a person, right? So it doesn't take long when you're talking 100,000 deaths to, if it's now, one of my forecasts was low, it was 13,000, and that would be great. I mean, I'm not saying it's great that they died, but it'd be great it's on the low end. But if we're looking at 60 to 130,000, you're going to have a lot of people who know someone who knows someone, at the very least, if you don't know someone directly. And this could be a coworker, this could be a friend, this could be someone on Facebook that is sharing things. I mean, we see a lot of our actual social circles are now much wider than they traditionally are. So my guess is yes, we will all know someone. It wasn't AIG. AIG survived, Lucas. It was Lehman Brothers. Lucas, it was Lehman Brothers that went down in August. It was Bear Stearns in March and Lehman Brothers in August. Yeah, Nikki's bringing up a real good point, that there's the reason I am preparing this is this kind of concentrated, I study death and violence for a living, and usually it's the mitigation. I get a little bit in the psychology of it, but you have to understand when death occurs unexpectedly in a concentrated form in a short period of time, that creates ripple effects that you don't have to be standing right where it happens. I've seen studies where there is, after the Virginia Tech school shooting where 30 people were killed or something like that, there was a ripple effect of PTSD from people who were afraid to go on campus in their own schools. Now, people can argue whether that's valid or not, or whether that's a good response or not, but the response is real. People actually are suffering from that. And I think, and it happens when it's violent, unexpected, concentrated, and short term. If, I go back to 9/11, which was a psychic scar for many of us. I'm not saying it would have been better if the 3,000 people who died in 9/11 had been killed over the course of a year. But imagine the difference if over the course of a year, there were a lot of little attacks and we were dealing with a campaign, but the death toll was spread out over a year. The fact that it happened all at once in a day in front of us, and we're watching it happen, that adds it's like a multiplier effect on the personal resonance we have, and the resonance then multiplies the psychological trauma. What I'm trying to prepare people for in April is to give them, sometimes, it's not unexpected if you know it's happening. I mean, I don't like putting these charts together, but the reason I'm doing it is to give people a guide map to say, here's the range of options, here's what it will mean, begin preparing, because it takes that unexpected factor away from you. It's not like you were surprised by it. Unfortunately, a lot of people are surprised, and they will have that greater experience, but it's still going to be a very heavy shock. Also, the workers, we're going to be dealing with the frontline responders. Think if you're not just a nurse or a doctor, like a frontline responder, an emergency service tech, but say you're a deliverer, and every day you go out and you wonder, is this a day I'm going to get infected? And I'm delivering all this stuff so people can, bake cookies and share recipes and do all this stuff. I'm actually seeing a shift more in the sort of knowledge worker, work at home crowd to being more, let's make masks, let's get involved. I mean, I'm seeing that good shift, but there's going to be a real class divide from blue collar workers who were deemed essential and had to put themselves at risk to white collar workers who were able to work from home and perceived relative comfort. And that will create trauma. The feeling of I had to put myself at risk for someone who did not share in my risk. The way you mitigate that is exactly what's happening. If we know that the workers working at home created masks, they did, what they could, they provided supports, and they did all the things they could to help. That can go a long way to mitigating some of those concerns. It's not going to mitigate the trauma, though. You're going out in an at-risk situation, and as you're out in the environment, when you hit these environments, there are parts of New York City that is fine right now. People still walking around, but there are parts that are very scary to go through because you're looking at the actual physical manifestation of these charts and these graphs and all these numbers. You're seeing mortuary trucks, you're seeing cremation trucks from the US Army, you're seeing body bags, you're seeing, people, you're seeing guards outside hospitals, you're seeing things that you're not used to seeing. So I think the psychological effect is going to be with us for a long time. Oh, interesting. Sinead, thanks for chipping in, Sinead. Sinead, another system dynamicist, building simulation models, go SD, woo. Ireland and unknown to us until 4 weeks ago. We have all of a sudden a gold standard and can borrow what we want while earning us a massive recession to follow. Irish future, good luck. I mean, that's the truth is long-term picture, the economic forecast is not looking good. The last thing the world needed was to throw a several $1 trillion additional bar tab. I mean, it's for good cause, don't get me wrong, but we were already looking at high debt to GDP levels, aging populations, Social Security, trust fund insolvency in 2030. We were looking at a lot of bad situations that the 2020s, because we skipped the 2010s. The 2020s are really where we needed to address that. That's off the table now. So good luck in 2030. Hopefully the infomullet's still there and Bonky's still providing support. Yep. So, okay, I think I've caught up with all the questions. I appreciate everyone staying. I realize it's a lot after the hour, so I want to be respectful of time, but it's 2:45. If everyone's good on questions, I'm going to, once again, www.patreon.com/infomullet, become a Mulletier subscriber, support us, support Bonky with his very expensive can of peaches habit. He's just going right through the stockpile. But again, if you have any more questions, leave a comment. I'll try and get to it. But I think I'm going to say goodbye for now and close this out. Hope everyone has a good day. Stay safe, stay inside if you can, avoid non-essential things. You know the drill. Everyone be good. Take care. Thanks for watching the video. Hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to follow the InfoMullet, visit us on Facebook or Twitter. And if you'd like notifications when we post new video content, click on the red subscribe button below the video. If you've ever wanted to become a Mulletier and support the InfoMullet, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate the support.